Welcome, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot, and if you are here today for How Parents Can Boost Kids' Well-Being and Resilience During the Pandemic with Phyllis Fagell, you are in the right place. We are so glad to have you with us again. I am, as I said, Charlene Margot, co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, the organization that brings you this program, the Parent Education Series. We could not be more delighted to have with us Phyllis Fagell today. So again, today, as we mentioned, we're going to be talking about how parents can boost kids' well-being and resilience during the pandemic. Obviously, this is a very important topic for all of us as world events change and the pandemic continues. So we're so glad that we have expert Phyllis Fagell with us today, who's going to share some really wonderful advice for all of us. Today's event, I should mention, is generously funded by Mills Peninsula Hospital Foundation and the San Mateo County Office of Education. We thank you to the Executive Director, Mary McGrath of Safe and Supportive Schools, and Mills Peninsula for underwriting this event. Again, special thanks to today's presenter. And today, we're going to be in a webinar format. Most of you by now are familiar with Zoom, but this is a webinar, so there are two ways for you to interact with us. There's both a chat button. My co-founder, Bev Hartman, will be putting resource links in the chat, so please do check that out. You can talk to one another, you can chat with us, but we'd like you to put your questions in the Q&A. So questions in the Q&A, comments to one another, and us in the chat. Look for resources there. Let's see, what else? Today's event is going to be video recorded and will be available on our video library for a limited time. So when you see that link, if you're not able to attend today or would like to share with one of your friends or colleagues or partners in our parent community, please do so. All right, let's get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Phyllis. Phyllis Fagell is the school counselor at Sheridan School in Washington, D.C., a therapist who works with kids and families in private practice, and an author and journalist. She is the author of Middle School Matters and a frequent contributor to the Washington Post. Phyllis also writes for Psychology Today, CNN, Working Mother, U.S. News and World Report, and Your Teen, and her ideas have been shared in national outlets, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and NPR. She attended Dartmouth College, the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and Johns Hopkins University for a master's in counseling. She lives in Bethesda, Maryland with her husband and 3 children. Please join me in a really warm virtual welcome for Phyllis Fagell. Phyllis, so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, and thanks for that nice welcome. I'll add that those 3 children really, between the children that I work with in the school setting who are in grades K through 8 and the 3 teenagers living in my house, which include a middle schooler, an 18-year-old, and a college student, I feel like I've really had a great glimpse of the range of emotions and experiences and challenges that kids are experiencing right now. And so while I'll be fairly general with strategies, I am choosing ones that can apply to lots of different ages. And when we get to the Q&A, I'm happy to include, to answer any questions related to specific age groups that you might be interested in. So let me just share my slides. Okay, great. So as we are in almost 2 years into this pandemic and supposedly in a new normal, what's really challenging is that the new normal is as challenging in many ways, if not more so, than parts of the pandemic have been along the way, even as restrictions are getting loosened, even as kids are in school and their life starts to take on some rhythm and routine that resembles what they had prior to the pandemic. And there are some reasons for that. One is that their nervous system has been overtaxed for such an extended period of time. And so they're tired, their stamina is down. But the biggest reason that they're still struggling is that they have lost opportunities to really experience specific developmental milestones or even just have lots of practice doing things and having interactions that involve honing their social skills, figuring out how to interpret feedback in a way that's accurate. All of these things that are hard for kids anyway are even harder. And if you look at this chart, you can see the last time a senior in high school today had a completely normal, mask-free, non-disrupted year with no pandemic at all was in 9th grade. And for my 8th graders here, the last time was 5th grade and so on. And my 8th grader, I had been joking with him that because he was home for a good chunk of the beginning of last year, and then when he returned, it was very choreographed for a while. I said, you know, some people would be really glad to maybe bypass 7th grade. It can be a very challenging year. And then lo and behold, he entered 8th grade and he started to have a lot of the stereotypical challenges that kids experience in 7th grade, which is when I realized the universe will right itself. No one gets a pass on 7th grade. And so they're sometimes not necessarily in the body that matches where they are emotionally. Even my 3rd graders, they're getting this rush of hormones and they're starting to really have that sensitivity and a heightened awareness of where they fit in the social order, how they perform in relation to others. And yet in many ways, they're presenting as much younger and looking for a lot more nurturing than a 3rd grader might typically want. And of course, we know that kids are struggling with emotional challenges. 1 in 3 children have been and teens have been reporting symptoms of depression or anxiety. And we want to make sure that we're paying attention. And it can be very challenging right now to know when to worry because everybody is compromised to at least a certain degree. So here's some of what I'm hearing. And this crosses different age groups from teens to, you know, lower elementary school or to my college student. And one of them relates to just that executive functioning piece. Kids are having a hard time keeping all of the balls in the air. If you have a child who's under age 15, they don't have that ability to do what's called future planning or anticipate how their work effort today is going to impact what they produce tomorrow anyway. That doesn't even kick in yet. But then on top of that, we have that decreased stamina from simply adjusting to so many things, not only with the pandemic, but there is a lot going on in the world right now. Because kids want to be good people, because they want to be kind and be a listener and be seen as someone that others can count on, they often can find themselves having trouble setting good boundaries. And that's even more critical right now, because if you have a really needy friend who's maybe keeping you in a text chain late at night when you need to sleep, or you have another friend who needs constant reassurance or has huge challenges that you can't manage for them or help them with, it can be hard to dial back. And then on top of that, the kids who are helping their friends often are struggling themselves. So you have an impaired 9th grader helping a similarly impaired 9th grader. And so what I've been reminding kids is you're not only unable to support them, in fact, they may need a trained professional to support them, but you're also impeding them from getting the support they need. Instead, be a bridge, help them figure out which adult they could talk to or who might be a better person for them to approach for help. And at home, as parents, you can tell your children to blame it on you. If they're being kept online longer than they want, or they feel like it's too much for them, tell them to say that their parents, so they had to get off, that they do need that support, because it can feel like they're not being kind when they tell somebody that they really need to shut it down for the evening. Even if your child did tons of activities and always capably handed in their homework, just met all of their responsibilities, and even if they're continuing to do so, you might be finding that they are just exhausted all of the time. And this is a really good time to have them reassess which activities are really important to them, maybe stagger them a little bit or do them in sequence as opposed to trying to do the exact same amount of things they did before. Because on top of that homework, on top of the activities, on top of readjusting, they also are managing social interactions after school as well. I had a 7th grader tell me that they were feeling sad all of the time. And part of the reason they were upset was because they were sad. And the other reason they were upset was because they didn't know why they were sad. And I sat her down and I said, you know, when I talk to kids who tell me they're sad and they don't know why, or they name an emotion that they think they're feeling and they don't know why, often they haven't quite hit the nail on the head and gotten the right emotion. Is it possible you're feeling something else? I even got out a feelings wheel, which helps kids see a broader range of feelings. Sometimes their vocabulary can be limited when it comes to describing what's going on in their internal life. And sure enough, she realized that what she was actually feeling was worried. And once she realized she was worried and not sad, we could target what she was concerned about. And she ended up coming up with a mantra: just because I'm scared doesn't mean anyone is in danger. and that was what worked for her. But she could never have gotten to that problem solving if she had not been able to identify with some specificity what she was feeling. When it comes to communicating with your children, you may, if you have a younger student or an elementary student, maybe they're still telling you everything. As they start to get closer to middle school and beyond, it can be a lot harder to elicit a real dialogue and know what's going on in their life. And it can be easy to conclude that they don't want to share what's going on with them. Do not come to that conclusion. Most kids do want your advice. They do want to hear what you might offer, what you can offer them, or hear about similar experiences you've had. What they really are afraid of is that you're going to overreact or that you're going to tell them what to do. So you want to just make sure that you're really listening non-judgmentally and calmly, and then offering help as opposed to just providing them what you think the answer is to their issue. Everybody feels awkward. An 8th grader was sure that she was always everybody's second choice. And I was perplexed because this was a girl who everybody liked, and she was never alone. She was always talking to people at recess, had people to sit with at lunch. And to an outside observer, just watching her interact with her peers, I really had a hard time squaring away her self-image with what was actually happening in the school setting. And I thought about it and I said, I have a theory. I think that maybe what's happening is that your friends are so comfortable with you and they can really be their authentic self because you're just always consistently you. They're just not bending over backwards to try to impress you or make you laugh. They're just relaxed. And I actually think that's the highest compliment you could get. And just then one of her friends was walking by my office, and I asked the girl who I was talking with if it was okay to run the scenario by that close friend of hers. And she said yes. And sure enough, that friend immediately jumped in to say, are you kidding? You're nobody's third wheel. You're everybody's first choice. It's just that we don't have to be anything that we're not. We can just be with you, and it's really easy. And so it's really important, and I'll talk about some strategies to do that in a minute, that we help kids not go right to that worst case scenario, because they are sensitive and they are worried about who their friends are and where they fit in. And then this last quote is, I get so angry, I fight with my parents about nothing, and then I feel worse. And I think it's important to remember that I can tell you, I have never met a student who feels good when they lose control. They always tell me it feels awful. Understand that if they lose control, or if they have a tantrum of some sort, or the teen version of a tantrum, really what's happening is they are just having trouble self-regulating, and they need you to help them come back down. And then once they're in a calm place, you can get to that problem solving. And I'll be talking about that a little bit too. So going back to the friendship piece, and just to give a little snapshot of one phase in middle school, when kids are starting middle school, only 1/3 of friendships last from fall to spring. If you ask kids to name their best friend, only half of those people name them back. If you look at who kids' friends are in 6th grade, 12% have nobody who names them as a friend. And if you follow kids from 7th grade to 12th grade, only 1% of friendships go the whole distance, which sounds really dire and awful to adults, but is incredibly reassuring to kids themselves. And I think we can extrapolate from that data to kids who are older and kids who are younger, because all along the way, what they're doing is doing that hard work to figure out what they can give to a friend and what they need from a friend. And in order to do that work, you have to try on different identities. You're going to outgrow friends. You're going to find that you get better at making sure you're choosing consistent friendships, people who make you feel good. And that work has a lot of ups and downs involved in it. And it really is heartbreak for kids when they get fired or dumped by a friend. It feels awful, and you want to be validating that you understand. And this is another time when it can be really helpful to share a story with them from your own childhood. I do tell kids that when they get rejected, or they perceive they're getting rejected, and kids tend to misinterpret feedback, never for the positive, about 40% of the time, I have them play the maybe game. If they're an older teen or even a college student, it might be more about helping them develop some cognitive flexibility. I might frame it differently. But the general idea is that I want them to come up with 5 alternative reasons that the person didn't include them, or the person slighted or offended them, that aren't negative, that are just pretty benign. And then I give the disclaimer that they don't actually have to believe those alternate stories they come up with. I just want them to practice that practice thinking more flexibly. So maybe a group of kids who are your closest friends got together and didn't invite you or didn't include you, and that feels really bad, but maybe they were all at soccer practice together just before and it just organically bled into hanging out. Or maybe somebody had tried you and typed in one wrong number when they were trying to text you, or maybe somebody thought you were visiting a relative that weekend. Again, just teaching them how to not go straight to that catastrophizing and pull their thoughts back to the middle. And there's a lot of interference when it comes to whether it's interpreting feedback or making good choices. And by interference, I mean just difficult emotions, maybe jealousy or anger or competitiveness or insecurity. Lots of things can get in the way of making good decisions. And we want to make sure, often kids won't admit that they feel jealous or won't admit that they're full of rage because it feels shameful in some way. And we want them to understand there's no such thing as a shameful feeling. In fact, feelings are not even voluntary. They're just going to wash over you. You don't control your feelings. On the other hand, you do control what you do with those feelings. If you post something mean, that's not okay. If you spread a rumor, also not okay. And you are accountable for how you behave. And we want to be helping them from the youngest age possible, really be emphasizing the skills of likability. All the research shows that kids who get status from power, from aggression, from meanness, actually have really poor long-term outcomes. They suffer in different ways than a target might suffer, but they do suffer. They have more substance abuse, more failed relationships, less higher education, more job instability. And so while early in my career, it was really hard for me to call a parent and say, you know, your child was not being kind to someone, I felt like I was assailing their parenting or saying that their child didn't have good character. I really have no problem making that call now. Number one, because I always preface it by saying this has nothing to do with your child's character, and they're all making mistakes and they're well-meaning mistakes, but because I know that I'm doing them no favors if I don't help them figure out how to develop those likability skills instead, you know, how to be a good listener, reciprocity, generosity. So if you're in the car with them and you hear them saying something mean or making a comment that you know is unfair or planning something that would be kind of cruel, you want to really pause and talk about it with them and call it out. And especially as kids get older, I know parents can struggle with how they should handle those interactions. They don't want to embarrass their child. They don't want to overstep. And you can come at it in a lot of different ways and even just express some curiosity, ask them to repeat themselves, maybe say you're surprised to hear them say that, but get some kind of a conversation going so you have an opportunity to help them maybe pause and think about it with a little bit more analysis and thinking about how that might play out. If they're having trouble even reaching out to a friend or making plans, which can be really tricky for kids. I think we forget as adults how hard it is to take a social risk. We want to be getting them outside their comfort zone. We want to be helping them take really small risks. Maybe first we tell them that they can just kick up a conversation with someone based on something they're wearing or helping them find that commonality. And then maybe it will build to finding out what they do on the weekends, which can then turn into asking them if they ever want to do that activity on the weekend, which might then progress to texting them or inviting them. So recognizing that it can take a little bit of time. And then for kids, in terms of helping kids make good decisions, I think we have to remember that nobody who is a child, even a teen, has the capacity to make solid decisions all of the time. And especially on the younger end, they have no life experience. They have no perspective. They really need a framework. They need some help for making these decisions. And so there are two strategies that I really like that I'll share with you. One is to do what's called the values card activity. And if you Google values cards, you can find a list of values, and it probably will come with lots of instructions that you can just completely ignore. This is what they look like if you print them out and cut them up. They're just things like responsibility, risk, genuineness, kindness, helpfulness, fun, knowledge, and print out 2 copies, one for them and one for you. And first go through them, explain what the different values are, make sure they understand, and then ask them to choose the 10 values that they think most reflect the kind of person they want to be, the kind of person they want to surround themselves with. You can do this at the same time next to them because it's a great way to share what's important to you without lecturing them, which often will help make kids shut down. And then what you want to do is explain to them that if they're in a situation and they're not sure what to do, and they're pretty sure that it might not go the way they want, but maybe there's some interference getting in the way. Maybe they know that what they want is at odds with being kind, or they might get in trouble. Have them pause and ask themselves which of the decisions they're considering is most aligned or most consistent with those 10 values. I've had students who've done that with me in 6th grade and carried it in their binder all the way through school, because they just take a look at it, look back at it, and it's been helpful to them over the years. The second one here is inoculation theory. This you can start young too. It's based on research done at Dartmouth College. And the idea is that you can inoculate kids against making bad decisions the same way you can inoculate them against the flu. And the way it works is that you preview a scenario and you tell them why they might be inclined to do what probably is the tempting, but not necessarily the best thing. So it might be, you're going to hear some juicy gossip and you're going to want to share it. Maybe you're going to want to share it at lunch because it's fun to have the best story, to have all eyes on you. You can feel powerful in that moment. And then the second part of inoculation theory is when you tell them, you give them a compelling counter reason why they don't want to do that. And that's when you might say something like, it's even better. And it feels really, really good to be known at the person who everyone trusts, the person who's just a vault. And what's cool about inoculation theory is that you don't have to do it for every last temptation they're going to face. You can choose the ones that you think are most salient or most immediate for them. But if you do this enough times and across enough scenarios, they actually learn to think that way themselves. So you're giving them a decision-making framework in that way as well. It's just another tool. If you don't like their friends, or you can see that they're going to get dropped, it's not going to end well. I think we've all been there where we've seen our children go down a road and we get a little nervous that maybe that particular friend group isn't the right fit, or it doesn't seem like they can be themselves when they're together. Instead of telling them that they shouldn't be friends, or instead of saying those people are not good for you, ask questions, help them learn how to analyze that situation themselves. Again, this is when they're doing a lot of that work to figure out what they need from a relationship and what they can give. And if they don't develop those skills, if we do that work for them, then they're going to have a hard time later on for any number of situations, whether they're choosing a life partner or maybe even leaving a job with an abusive supervisor. We want them to be thinking along those same lines. We want them to understand that while the old saying was that, the sort of just say no was my era, and that people would pressure us to do something that we didn't want to do. Really what the research shows is that it's peer presence and not peer pressure. It's who you're with that determines the choices you make more often than feeling pressured to make a choice. So really helping them understand that you are who you're with, and then helping them choose their battles. This is a big one in the school setting as a school counselor, because often what will happen is I'll get 9 8th grade girls at my door, 7th grade girls at my door, and they're all talking at once and they're trying to tell me what happened. And it's usually something that involved social media the night before, or maybe something with another school. It could be anything. And what I first do is pause and say, let me figure out who is central, who's at the core of this drama, who are the people who are directly involved. And it can eliminate a lot of the sort of aftershocks of the drama that they're experiencing. And while it can seem like kids like drama or are drawn to it, and there are rare exceptions of kids who do genuinely like it, most think they like it, and then once they step into it, want to do whatever they can to get back out. And the harder, the more you get out of your lane and start taking on other people's issues, the harder it is to get back out of that drama. If your child goes to the other side and they just really struggle with social skills, they're legitimately awkward, or they interrupt a lot, or they're just a lot for one target friend, you want to make sure that rather than just choosing 1 or 2 kind kids to hang out with, which is often the advice that parents will get when their kids are awkward, I actually think it's more effective to have shorter, structured hangouts with a broader range of kids, so they get more opportunities to practice skills without turning off somebody who might find them too much if it's in larger doses. But all kids do need social support. And I think that is another misconception, especially about older teens. I work in private practice with teens as well, and I'll have plenty of them tell me that they don't know how to do things like just enter a conversation or interject if they want to make their own point. And so it's okay, with their permission, of course, to offer some concrete suggestions. So for that kid, I said, why don't you try just listening for a few minutes to what they're talking about. Once you have a sense of the direction the conversation is going in, ask a question related to that topic. Everyone likes answering questions about themselves. And she came back and reported that it made her feel much more relaxed because she did have something she could do in that moment when she was standing there just feeling painfully awkward. And then if they're on social media, which, at a certain point, there's no turning back. And even if they're not, but they're using an iPad to text, an exercise I like to have kids do is go through all of their posts, all of their snaps, all of their Instagram texts, if it's just texts. Often with the kids who have iPads but don't have phones yet, you'll see these enormous group chats via text that don't always go so well. Have them go through and find the one that doesn't reflect those values, or that doesn't reflect who they want to be, or they're a little bit cringy because they can see that they were trying too hard, or their joke fell flat, or they felt overexposed and revealed too much about something, or said something that was mean that they couldn't then recall and tone got lost, whatever it is. And then follow up with, what was the situation? What was going on at the time you made that comment, or when you had that aberrant post? And often they'll realize, oh, you know what? It was late at night and I had my phone in my bedroom, or, I was in a really bad mood because I just had gotten cut from the tennis team. And once they have a sense of the kinds of things that can get in their way, they can set themselves up for success. So they're less likely to make the same mistake twice. So when it comes to talking to them and maintaining open lines of communication, again, they do not want you to have a big overreaction. And if they feel criticized, if they feel judged, you're not going to get very far. So giving them a runway back to being a good kid when they make a mistake. And these are just some of my favorite phrases. I'm guessing you did that because, or do you think you were your best self in that situation? I bet it felt awful when. I wonder, and I've noticed, are great non-judgmental phrases. And then showing that empathy. I'd be embarrassed too if I thought my teacher had called me out in front of my peers. This morning, I had some elementary students in here, and they had all been unkind to one another in various ways. And so I gave them an index card and I said, I want you to anonymously write yes or no to the question, do you think you've been your best self? And I was really almost sort of laughing to myself when I saw the answers, because it was almost like you had all the different temperaments. The kid who goes straight to guilt and was like, yes, I have not been my best self, and I really need to clean up my act. Another person who, tends to be on the more defensive side and said, yes, I've been my best self. And just looking at those answers was revealing, because kids have a really hard time admitting when they've made a mistake, and we have to make it as easy as possible for them to come back and just change what's happening. So, yep, I understand why you made that decision. Maybe you cheated on that test because you didn't want anyone to know you didn't know what you were doing. I can understand that, but here's why it's not okay. And now let's talk about what you can do next. The picture on the right is my puppy, Moose, and he's not a puppy anymore. But when we first got him, he loved to go under my bed, and it was a nice hiding spot for him. And as he got bigger, he continued to go under the bed. But at some point, he was too big to both go under and come back out. So he'd go in, he'd get stuck, and then he'd cry, and we would rescue him. And I kept waiting for him to learn that if he goes underneath the bed, he's not coming out on his own. But really, it took a surprisingly long time for him to figure this out. And it just brings to mind the expression, where does good judgment come from? Experience. Where does experience come from? Bad judgment. The kids of all ages are going to make tons of mistakes, and we want to make sure that we are approaching them in a way that doesn't make it impossible for them to ask for our help. One of my favorite quotes, and I think this was in Middle School Matters, was an expert who said, if you overreact when they break a vase, they're never going to tell you when they get a dent in the car. So just moving on to the emotional piece and helping them build a coping toolbox, because again, 1 in 3 are reporting symptoms of anxiety or depression. We really want to make sure that they not only have strategies, but that they feel like they have strategies, because if they feel empowered to help themselves, they're going to get less stressed in the first place. And there is nothing that we can do to shield them from discomfort. I think if there's nothing else that's the last couple of years have shown us, it's that. And we know that kids can be relentlessly self-critical. Often I'll have them share I have a Worry Busters group. I might have them share with the other students in the group what's going on in that internal dialogue. And they're so relieved to find out that other people are as self-defeatist as they are, but we really want them to be challenging that internal voice. So one strategy I do, it's positive Post-its. I give them a stack of Post-it notes, and I ask them to write down as many positive things about themselves as they can come up with. And it can be superficial. It can be they like their hair, they're good at soccer, they're a good listener, they're good at math, whatever they like about themselves. And often if they're struggling, I'll say, well, what would a friend say? Or what would your parents say? I want to build as long a list as I can. And then, and this is similar to that maybe game where I want them to learn to challenge that negativity. I tell them to put it up around their computer or in a binder somewhere where they can see it. And I explain that it takes 4 positives to make up for 1 negative. And if they catch themselves being self-critical, I want them to force themselves to read those sticky notes so that, again, they can pull their thoughts back to the center. It's also really not intuitive to teens and to kids that every perceived weakness also might have their biggest strength embedded in it. I always think of kids who have ADHD in this category because they might be impulsive, they might blurt things out in class, but they also tend to bring a lot of dynamism to the conversation, and they tend to make it safer for other kids to raise their hand and take risks. So really helping them think about what that shadow strength is to that perceived weakness. I've seen more perfectionism, probably as a result of the same feelings of being small and powerless related to the pandemic. Kids have not had a lot of control over their destiny in the last couple of years. And so I think perfectionism is on the rise, in part because grades are one of the few things that you can control, or they think they can control. And so we want to be helping them figure out what's a reasonable, attainable expectation, because if they're shooting for the moon and it's not going well, they're really setting themselves up for disappointment. So what I do is I get out a ladder, a picture of a ladder, there's a picture on the right there, and I ask them what their goal is, and we break it down into all the rungs on the ladder. And then just as they think we're done, I add another rung between each of those rungs. And I say, if we were going to break it down even more, what would we put in between those? Just helping them consider that perhaps they're expecting too much of themselves. If they're avoiding something, and the way this has manifested lately is kids, especially kids who might have stayed virtual longer than other students in my school, maybe missed more Spanish instruction or feel farther behind in math, are resisting going to class sometimes, especially this one student doesn't want to go to Spanish class. And so I explained to her that the only way to get over a fear is to face it, but you want to face it at just the right level. So have your child rank the fear on a scale of 1 to 10. How big of a risk is it? Maybe they'll say it's an 8 or a 9. After they give you that number, ask them what would constitute a risk in the 4 to 7 range. If they're on the younger side, you can help them figure out what a risk might be in the 4 to 7 range. In the case of this student, what we did was I said, skipping class, sitting in my office during Spanish is not an option. But what we can do is, and we worked this out with the teacher, initially, the teacher promised not to call on them. The next step, once we got them back in the class, was to have the teacher call on them, but they fed that student the answers or the questions in advance, so she had a chance to prepare her answer. And then ultimately, we want to be working toward just normal full engagement in the class. So you're always pushing that envelope. If you go too slow, it reinforces to them that they can't do it. If you push them too far and too fast, then and it doesn't go well, then that fight, flight, or freeze part of their brain, their amygdala, is going to fire danger, danger, danger for forevermore, and they might avoid it even more assiduously going forward. We want them to understand that you can have 2 competing, contradictory emotions at the same time. So yeah, you might be scared, but you can also anticipate an event and think it might be fun, or you might meet new people, you might be excited. You can be scared and brave. And especially now, we know that kids are having such a jumble of emotions. We don't want them to discount the positive simply because there's negative mixed in. And we want them to take a break from worrying. I think parents have been surprised when we tell them, at least here, I'm in Washington, D.C., the students are really struggling. And it's not always completely apparent at home. Even to fellow students, it's not always apparent. They can put on a really pretty brave or happy face. But when you do activities that ask them if their outside matches their inside, and I sometimes will do that with art or with word clouds, you can see that they do have, there's just a lot going on under the surface. And we don't want them to be spending all their energy worrying. As it is, they need to conserve their energy. Their stamina is down. So one of my favorite things to do, if you have a younger kid, although I'll give you I'll tell you one other thing about this guy. This is a worry monster. He eats worries, and the kids write down the worries and they put it in. And I got this from my younger elementary students. And something that was really interesting to me is that I had this worry box, very sophisticated worry box for my older students at home. I will write it on an index card and stick it in the freezer and just show my own 13-year-old, I'm going to put this on ice. But I was having these younger students put it in the worry monster, and then the middle schoolers saw it and they didn't want to use the sophisticated worry box. They wanted to use the worry monster as well. And I think that goes back to the chart on the first slide. These are students who really need a lot of nurturing. They're presenting as younger than they are right now. And so things that I might have thought were too juvenile actually make them feel good, make them feel cared for, and they really enjoy it. And middle schoolers, if you have a middle schooler, they can be 13 going on 3 or 13 going on 30, depending on the day anyway, with or without all of the things that are happening in the world. Journaling, if your child is a writer or enjoys writing, can be helpful, because what kids start to see over time is that they survive 100% of their worst moments, even the most embarrassing possible things. They do survive them. It's not easy and it's not fun, but it's just it's evidence that they did come through. They persevered. Before the pandemic, I did a lot of mindfulness, but I've been doing less mindfulness now. I'll share a few mindfulness strategies I still have been using, but what I've been doing instead is what's called activating the parasympathetic nervous system. And the reason I think this has been more effective is because it works by relaxing the body in order to calm your thoughts, whereas mindfulness operates on calming your thoughts to relax your body. And a lot of kids are having a harder time staying in their body, sitting with their thoughts. They're more uncomfortable than they'd like. And so some of my favorite ways to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, one is to take the thumb on one hand and press on the pressure point below the thumb on the other, hold it for a few seconds, and then switch. Another is to give themselves a tight self hug. Another is to tense and release their shoulders. They can also splash water on their face. I try to give them some tools that are pretty easy to just quietly do in a classroom without anyone noticing. For the mindfulness strategies that I do still like, one is for test anxiety or quiz anxiety, or if they have to present, I have them carry an object into the room with them. I'm just going to grab, here's a paper clip, might be a paper clip, something small. And right before they sit down to take that test or do that tryout, come up with 3 adjectives to describe what they're holding. And that works because your brain is like a light switch. You can't have that fight, flight, or freeze part of your brain on at the same time as your problem solving, reasoning, logical part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex. And one way to turn that light switch off on the amygdala, the fight, flight, or freeze, and turn on that problem solving part of your brain is by retrieving language. So describing an object, coming up with those adjectives, retrieving language really does work. Another way to retrieve language, especially if you have a more active boy or girl, is to take a ball and toss it to them, play catch, and count as you're throwing the ball back and forth. That can help them calm down too. And if they're at school and they're able to go do that somewhere, if there's balls outside, it's something they can do for themselves if recess happens to be problematic. I talked about labeling feelings. That's the only way to get to the problem, the real problem, so that you can come up with a solution. That spaghetti on the right is because I really do feel like it's important for children to understand that when we do strategies with them, when we try things, it really is like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. We don't want them to get discouraged if the first thing doesn't work. And we want them to understand that a strategy that works in one situation may not be helpful in another. And so doing the work to figure out what helps them and when is really, really useful and empowering. Again, we don't want one impaired eighth grader asking another impaired eighth grader for help that they can't adequately provide to them. So when they're calm, we want to ask them, which adult would you go to in a crisis? And there's a few reasons to ask that question. One is because you don't want them going through that exercise when they are in crisis. You want them to be thinking about it when they're calm. The second is that kids don't intuitively ask for help, let alone ask an adult for help. And the third is to just normalize that help-seeking behavior that might also not be intuitive to them. And you can explain, it doesn't have to be the parent, it doesn't have to be a school counselor, it can be anybody that they can think of who would provide that mature, calm ability to help them. If they're having a really hard time seeing the positive, seeing a way out of a dilemma, out of a scenario that's causing them distress, you might need to give them some emotional distance. One of my favorite questions is, well, what would you tell a friend in the same situation? Temporal distancing is just helping them think through, well, how do you think you'll feel about this in 10 hours? How about 10 days, 10 weeks, 10 months? And helping them put that in perspective. And you can also, especially if they're hitting that age where it's harder for them to talk about what's happening in their internal life, use characters from shows, from stories you're reading, use anecdotes you've heard about kids in other parts of the city or that you've read about in the newspaper, anything to give them a little bit of emotional distance. And we want to be at all times helping them make meaning out of whatever they're experiencing. Like maybe they've learned something about themselves. Maybe they realize that they're really good at helping somebody else who's having a hard time. And we want them to focus not only on the things in their control, but the things that really matter to them. We want them picking their battles, because if they take on every last slight, every last point on a quiz that they think they were robbed of, really what's going to happen is they're going to find themselves just completely depleted. So focus on what they can control, but really also pay attention to the things that they can let go of and anticipate how getting more embroiled in a situation might even make them feel worse down the road. And then this last one here, be a buffer, not a fixer, I think is a good place to wrap up before I turn it over to Charlene and questions, because I think it's a great metaphor for raising kids right now. So the pediatrician, historically, if you brought an infant to the doctor for their shots, for their vaccines or inoculations, the pediatrician would take the infant, put the infant on the table, give them the inoculation, and then hand the baby back to the caregiver. They don't do that anymore. What they do now is they have the caregiver hold the baby while they're getting the shot. And objectively, it's the exact same experience, same size needle, should be the same pain. But when they measure the infant's physiological response, the amount of cortisol that's released, their heart rate, their distress is much lower, and they don't feel as distressed as they're going through that, getting that shot. And I think that has a lot to do with what we're trying to do for our children right now. We want to buffer them from all of the things that they're experiencing. We can't shield them from them entirely, but we can help them as they go through all of these inevitable bumps in the road, primarily by just honoring who they are, being really consistent and present in our love, like setting aside our devices when they really have something important they want to discuss with us, and just letting them know that we are there for them, whether they need us to give them reassurance and information or just help them lighten the mood. But just that consistency alone is such a predictor of how well a child will do as they are experiencing setbacks. And the mere fact that you're here on this Zoom tells me that you are that kind of a caregiver or educator. You're an educator. And so your children, your students are really lucky to have you in their lives. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing so Charlene can man the chat.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for all that brilliant advice. I am the 7-day new grandmother of a baby girl. And so there's so much to think about sort of starting over again. And I love how you set the stage about what parents can do to help kids in these times. So one thing is, I just reread your brilliant article for the Washington Post, how parents can help themselves and their children feel okay again. You say that parents, as well as kids, need reassurance right now. Why do you say that?
Emotions are contagious, and it's a really discombobulating time. And I think that we have to remember that adults are carrying their children's stress in addition to their own, and recognizing that it's very hard to be that non-anxious presence. It's very hard to stay even, to be the thermostat while they're the thermometer, if you don't acknowledge your own emotional state. You have to be able to step outside of yourself and just observe how you're feeling, recognize when you need to take a minute. One of the most effective ways teachers can manage a classroom is by telling the kids, you know what, I need to just take a couple minutes and take a few breaths. It's really a brave thing for a teacher to do, or it can feel brave to do, but the kids get that. It's very authentic too, to just let them know that you too are struggling and that you're in it together. And that's something else that kids tell me all the time. They don't want you, their parents or their teachers, anyone, to say to them, I know what you're experiencing, or this must be hard for you. They want to know that it's hard for you too, because they look up to you, you're the role model, and the fact that you're managing it too, and that you're finding ways to cope and model those coping strategies for them is really, really important.
I think that's a brilliant answer. Just sharing that you yourself are going through things too. And sometimes you need a break. Even remember taking timeouts myself, not putting the kids in timeout, but sort of putting myself in timeout. So Phyllis, here's a good question. And again, everybody has been so thoughtfully with us throughout your presentation. Thank you. Parent asks, can you please comment on supporting college students who are still teenagers? They are really depressed.
Yes. And so I have a freshman and a sophomore in college in my own family. So I really do recognize how challenging it's been. And I think that one of the things we can do for our children is help them see that if they are struggling, first of all, it's really normal. And there are lots of reasons that they're struggling. I saw that with my sophomore, because he went to school last year when everything was still virtual. So he was on campus, but he was really kept apart from everybody else. He didn't have a chance to really get to know people at first. But he seemed to love it anyway. And I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, because it really was just such a bizarre experience. He hadn't met throughout the entire year, he never met one of his professors, but he did eventually make friends. And then his sophomore year, they went through the rush process and he joined a fraternity. And all of a sudden, after he joined the fraternity he wanted to join, he got very, very upset. And he thought it was because maybe he chose the wrong fraternity, but it was really more complicated. It was almost like he was finally relaxing enough to just absorb all of the difficulties he had experienced the year before. Plus, mixed in with that was just this, it was a little destabilizing to have all of the friends suddenly go in different directions that following year, but helping them figure out what it is that's actually bothering them in the same way you would do with a younger child, helping them realize that they don't have to feel lousy. They can get some support. They can talk to a therapist. There might be some counseling services on site. Maybe they need to get more sleep or use fewer substances or get more exercise, but really having those conversations and destigmatizing it if that's something that they might need from you as well.
Was that true? What an interesting experience. Not at all what you would have expected, right?
No.
Joining fraternity and then feeling unsettled. Yes. It's so interesting. So Phyllis, in her recent, very prescient book, Ready or Not, our friend Madeline Levine talks about how parents need to allow their children to experience anxiety and discomfort. That's hard as a parent. In the long run, do you think that this pandemic maybe will give us more resilient children and teens?
There is research showing that young adults who live through periods of uncertainty, like graduating college in a recession is the example used in this research, actually have more joy, satisfaction, and flexibility throughout life. So I think we have to remember that it's protective to have a diversity of feelings, because if you don't ever have the lows, you don't know to appreciate the highs. And you can't have the peaks without those valleys. And so kids not only learn that it's normal to have those ups and downs, they learn how to manage them. They learn they can get through them. And there is no such thing as a problem-free life. And so the greater gift is not making sure they don't ever have a setback. The gift is we show them that they're able to manage it. They can persevere even when it's hard.
Well, that is so true, Phyllis. My mother, who was Canadian, used to say to us, into every life a little rain must fall. And I think kids, right, need to learn that too. Nobody gets that. Everybody has the squiggly line that Madeline Levine talks about, right?
That's right. Everybody thinks their parents' life is a straight line from seventh grade to success. So yes, I think it's really important to be normalizing. The other interesting research on this is that kids who know about their own family members, also what's called oscillating journeys, their ups and downs, the relative who was the first to go to college, the person who started a business, the factory burned down, but they came up with another venture. Kids who grow up hearing those stories about people they in their own families actually are far more resilient. Because again, you're normalizing that life is really uneven at times.
Really great advice. As Darlene mentions here, isn't one of the key answers to be a good listener and listen deeply? Yes. Yes, that's one of the elements of compassion. So Phyllis, a few weeks ago, we talked with Anya Kamenetz from NPR, and she mentioned that, we parents are also worried about the milestones and rites of passage that our kids have missed, quinceañeras, birthdays, graduations, and all of that. And she feels in a way that we need to make it up to them. Do you agree, or do you think that there's a better way to frame those losses?
I think that we don't want to dismiss those losses. I was reading an article earlier today about how people tend to associate grief with death. But grief is really about loss, any loss. It can be a small loss or a big loss. It can be a missed milestone. It can be something you chose. It can be you left a job by choice, but it's still a loss to you, those relationships. And so I think we have to be taking our cues from our kids. So one kid might not have that quinceanera and feel totally fine that they were only able to mark it with 5 or 6 cousins, and it was good for them. Another one might really want to have a big party the following year for their birthday and invite all of their friends. So I don't think there's one right or wrong answer. Some of that might have to do with the child's temperament. And some of these milestones you can't make up. My oldest didn't have a high school graduation or a prom, and he's not going to get one. Like that ship has sailed. And so I don't think we want to be communicating that either that it doesn't matter and it's not important, or that you'll never be able to have, joy in your life because you didn't have that milestone, but rather to create new memories and new experiences.
And you would want to involve your child, right, Phyllis, in whatever that replacement celebration is, the planning of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because my son is 13, he had a lot of friends who had bat mitzvahs during the pandemic. And they all, for the most part, were just at most either a few family members or maybe they had a drive-by in their backyard. And so here we are a year later, and a few of them are having bigger parties. And a few of them don't want anything. They were happy they could just do that taco truck and call it a day, or just have only family members. So I don't think we want to be making assumptions about what our kids want, but having a conversation. And it may not be feasible, or it may not make sense for your family. And that's okay too, because that's something that kids have to adjust to as well over time.
We're all learning a lot about flexibility during this pandemic, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, goodness. So here's a question from a school board member. She asks, how do you support a college student who's not struggling socially, but rather academically when it's hybrid or remote learning? And how do you normalize getting help? That's a good question.
So for the normalizing help piece, there's a great website. It's parentandteen.com. It's Dr. Ken Ginsberg. He's a pediatrician at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he has a lot of great resources for convincing or having a conversation with your child about getting help, at least for emotional help. For the academic piece, what might be helpful is to just think about what might be getting in their way. And one of the things that I think is getting in not just kids' way, but adults' way as well, is that it's harder to hold a lot of information in our head that we used to be able to hold. And so I've been really encouraging my students to do what's called cognitive offloading, like getting it out of their head and onto a paper, using planners, using reminders on your phone or on paper, whatever works, and not trusting in the same way you might have before yourself to remember what you need to do. One of my favorite strategies, and I think this works as well for college as it does for 6th grade, is to take a piece of paper and divide it in half. And on the left, you put down what you have to do for the day. So this is the today column. And then on the right, it's the tomorrow column. And so as you do things, you cross them out. And as new things come up over the course of the day, you put it on the tomorrow column. And at the end of the day, anything that wasn't on the today column moves to the tomorrow column. And it's all in one view. And I think it's a lot easier to wrap your mind around what you need to do and what you have to, how you should budget your time than using a big, day at a glance kind of calendar, or having it be not visual because it's only on your phone.
I agree. That makes sense. My desk is covered with sticky notes and they move that way.
Yeah.
So Phyllis, we've talked a lot today about how parents need to show empathy and compassion towards their kids to encourage that autonomy and flexibility. But as you say, the pandemic has been hard on parents too. How do you give to your kids if your own emotional tank is empty?
So this is something that I've been talking to a lot of parents about lately, and a lot of educators and people in healthcare professions too. It's really important that you understand that the kind of support you need, according to the research, is not self-care in that traditional sense. It's not really, well, maybe yoga will help. And of course, it's always a good idea to get enough sleep. Really, the kind of support that's most helpful right now for you, in the same way it is for your kids, is to feel nurtured, to be spending substantive time having meaningful conversations with people who have your best interests at heart and care about you. So whether that means you have a relationship or an arrangement with a good friend that you're going to make sure you check in once a week and talk for an hour and have that substantive conversation, or you join a support group where you can talk to people who are in the same boat or maybe in the same profession. acgroups.org is a nonprofit by Dr. Sanaya Luthar. She's a professor emeritus from Columbia, and she's got a lot of groups that she's running virtually for people right now across professions, or just mixed, people from all over the country. And they meet for, I think, 12 sessions once a week with a trained facilitator. And they're really, really helpful because it just gives people a place to talk about everything that they're going through. It's a lot, especially if you're also worrying about your child's experiences. Just living and being alive right now with or without kids is difficult. And so you want to make sure that you have that nurturing and that support that you need for yourself as well.
Thank you. That's really great advice. Phyllis, how do we head back to the new normal? And how do we talk about normal at school with our students or parents? Do you have any advice?
So I think that one of the, maybe, I don't know if I would going to call it mistakes, it's more like a well-meaning mistake, is that in our desire to give kids back normalcy, we sort of have just launched them back into business as usual.
Yeah.
And they're still taking the tests and, navigating all of the same courses and all of the same homework assignments, all of it, doing the same activities, just as if nothing happened in a lot of cases. And then everybody's surprised that kids are falling apart.
Yeah. And
I think to navigate the new normal, we have to acknowledge it's not normal, and it probably won't be normal for quite some time, and scaffold that return and talk to kids about the things that they need in order to succeed as they're returning to school, whether it's more executive functioning help, more social emotional help, I have more worry buster groups for my students this year than I normally do. I have some different affinity groups than ones I've hosted in the past or facilitated in the past to meet kids' changing needs. And so just really trying to get a sense of where kids are and making it clear we don't expect them to be back to normal.
That is a great point. That is a great point. I think parents, I would use that too with your own kids. We don't expect everything to be normal. We don't expect you to feel normal. We don't. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, but a couple of great last questions, Phyllis. Priya asks, what are your thoughts about how mental health providers can address the increasing number of young people needing mental health intervention services? How can we turn the tide toward positive mental health? If you could answer that, that would be the $1 million question.
So is the question, how do we convince people to get the support?
How mental health providers can address the increasing number. I think maybe let's stick with the end of question. How can we turn the tide towards positive mental health, supporting mental health providers with so many kids needing help?
Yeah, and this is something that I've been struggling with lately, because I am hesitant at times to recommend a therapist to a family when I know there are none available. And, we're going to maybe have to rethink the models that we're offering, more groups as opposed to more individual. More kids might have to leave school during the day to get therapy because there's no after school appointments, and we might have to normalize that. Our schools might have to accommodate that in a different way. I think we have to be getting more mental health professionals into the school setting where kids are to support them. Even my school is hiring another counselor. I'm the only one here right now in my K-8, but we're going to hire another one for next year because the needs have ramped up so dramatically. And if we want to prioritize emotional health, we have to put those supports in place. And I don't think we can even talk about learning loss or helping kids make up lost ground academically before we address their emotional state, before we get them to a state where they're well enough to be functioning at that level again.
So well said. The bottom line is really our kids' emotional health, isn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Phyllis, you've given us so many brilliant pieces of advice today. I just would ask any closing remarks or big piece of advice that you want us to walk away with.
I think that this is not a big piece. That's too much pressure. So I'll just share something that's been helpful to me personally that I've been really trying to do for my own kids. And that is to turn off the news, lighten the mood. I have rejiggered my Twitter feed so that I see comedians first. Right now, I'm still going to find out what's going on in the world through them often, but at least it will be filtered somewhat. Make sure that they are getting a chance to be outside, to not really be thinking about heavy things. Watch a family movie, not have a family movie night where you watch a comedy that you love and they choose a comedy they love, tell jokes. But I do think that what kids really need is just some joy and levity and opportunities to just let some of the heaviness and cast it aside for a little bit. And I think we need that too.
Well, those were really beautiful parting comments. Phyllis Fagell, thank you so much for all your wisdom today. For all of you who joined us, what a wonderful session. Take care, everybody. We hope to see you soon. Stay well. And again, big thanks to Phyllis Fagell today for a brilliant conversation. Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.